Well, friends, good morning. Having been a preacher, I thought I'd start where I know where to start, and we can kind of go from there. Thank you for the invitation to be with you and to be part of your conversation, Bishop McAlilly, Sue, and Sky. Sue, especially for that introduction. It isn't that often that a speaker, is introduced as the person that helped to nauseate someone. But happy to have been of help. And it is good to be here in Memphis. Memphis is one of my favorite places to visit. I've worked with Methodists, I've worked with the Episcopalians and Baptists while I've been here over the years. It's a favorite. It has a lot to do with music and barbecue. And I got extra credit today because I drove through Germantown on my way. And Germantown is where my daughter-in-law is from. Now, I can't tell you how far that will go for me when I get home. Well, we're here because we're being invited into a conversation, and the conversation is not just here. The conversation is really pretty much across the whole connection. It's across all of North America in all of the mainline denominations. We are in a time in which we are being invited into a journey of faith. And hopefully part of what we'll be able to do this afternoon is talk about why. Why this conversation? Why us? And why now? Because we do have to go considerably deeper in understanding both our culture and ourselves and what it is that God now asks of us. And it does take time. It takes some homework. It takes a little bit of a roller coaster ride as we do that. And as you can tell by the slide, if we can get the slides up here, we'll work our way through. We're going to talk this afternoon about living into the change mission field, and it will be, and I hope it will be, an intentionally messy conversation. Friends, we are in a moment in which neatness is not a friend of the church. We are spending too much time trying to make things look neat rather than asking how to be faithful. And so this will not be a clear, clean, crisp conversation. We will not have answers at the end. But you will be invited into a conversation. The conversation starts with unsustainability. Have you gotten that point yet? It was a whole video. Sky and Sue, walk through your own numbers. The last time that the United Methodist Church gained members was 1965, the year that I graduated from high school. Since then, every single measure of people that we have had is going down. Every single measure of money that we have is going up. And as you heard Sky say, that means that we are now living off more and more money from fewer and fewer people who are getting older and older. We cannot continue that. It's a basic message. But the issue here isn't just the fact that we have lost members. You know, one of the things that I have discovered is that almost every conversation that I'm in has to start here, even though we know it. It really was no real surprise to you that we are in this position. You may not have had all of the patterns, you may not have had the numbers, but we know. But it is so difficult to look into unsustainability that after we see it, we tend to go back to business as we know it. In fact, across all of the years in the groups that I have worked with, what I've discovered is that increasingly I am working with people who are more tired and tired because they're working at harder and harder at what they've proven already doesn't work. Have you been there? There's a sense in which it's so hard to look at where we are that what we do is go back and we say, well, if we worked harder, maybe we could make it different. That really isn't where we have to begin. We have to take the unsustainability seriously. But when we do that, let's be careful. If we look into the messages of unsustainability, the first is that it is not about our former leaders. Let me say this as clearly as I can. Those who have gone before have been faithful and diligent in their work. They have done what was asked of them. They did what was appropriate to the mission field at that time. They have been faithful in what they have been taught and what they have taught, and now they have served the church. The dilemma, though, is that whenever we get into a point where we perceive that there's a problem, and if we can't explain the problem, one of the default positions of all systems is that when we can't explain what went wrong, we want to know who went wrong. Friends, this is not a search for who went wrong, because people did not go wrong. And that's part of what we're going to try to explore here this afternoon. We are still standing on the shoulders of the people who have gone before because of the good work that they have done. The second message in this kind of whole idea of unsustainability that I want us to capture really clearly is that it is caused by a mission field that has changed quickly but forcefully around us. And this is the place we're going to spend a good bulk of our time this afternoon. What is it that has changed in this mission field that has made it so different and so difficult for us? The third thing that's connected with unsustainability that we have to take very seriously is that we will describe many things this afternoon, none of which are problems. This is one of the hardest things for the church to get a hold of because we are born problem solvers. As a matter of fact, the way you get into leadership in North America is to demonstrate that you are a good problem solver. That's one of our formative definitions of leadership. The dilemma is that problem solving only works if there's a problem. And much of what we are now culturally facing in the United Methodist Church is not a problem because it has no solution. Part of the work of Ron Heifetz in leadership. Heifetz was a director of the Project of Leadership at the Harvard School of Government. And he makes a couple of very critical distinctions. And one of the distinctions he makes is between a problem and a condition. A problem is something for which there is a known solution. Problem solving is the application of a known solution to a known problem. That's what we are used to be able to do. But the great cultural shifts that we have been through are not things that can be solved. So they have to be treated in a very different way. And this he calls conditions. If it's not a problem, it's a condition that we have to learn how to live with. And did you hear the language there? It's something we have to learn how to live with. If you have a problem, what you do is you move directly to action. Where I come from in Pennsylvania, in February, if the boiler breaks down in the church on Tuesday, that is known as a problem. And what you do is you flip into problem solving and you put all those actions in line and you get the right person with the right tools and the right parts so that when you have worship on Sunday, there is heat and the problem is solved. Make sense? We know how to do that. But in many, many cases today, when we do that kind of problem solving, what it does, it actually takes us back to where we were before we had the problem. It doesn't move us ahead. In the current cultural shifts that we have been going through, we have to get away from problem solving and immediate responses of action and into a mode of learning. We are now learning the new mission field that God has given us. We have been set down in a new corner of God's kingdom without even having to change our address. And we have to learn this new place that God has given to us. And then the fourth thing that we have to remember with this message of unsustainability is that the opposite of unsustainable is not sustainable. This guy was absolutely right. To only try to make ourselves sustainable is the next step toward death. What we really are talking about is how does the United Methodist Church learn to live in this new place with vitality and with fruitfulness so that what we do bears fruit. And so the task of the mainline church is to take seriously where we are and learn how to move into this new mission field. How we doing? We okay so far? And this is where people would nod and they would say yes, and that encourages the speaker to go on. So let's kind of get in here with it, okay? Because we're going to go into the new mission field in a minute, but before we do that, we have to start with the baseline. There was a time. Friends, there was a time in which the culture itself pushed people toward the United Methodist Church, toward all mainline churches. There was a time in which one of the dominant values in our culture was to join, was to belong, was to be a member of something, because one of the things that happened was being a member of something gave you identity. You knew who you were by where you belonged. You knew how you fit into the rest of the community by where you had memberships. Other people knew who you were by what you did. Anybody remember that? Absolutely. There was a day in which it was inappropriate for anybody in North America to wake up without a congregation. Now, they had to be able to say, "That's my church," because that's what helped everybody figure out who they were. Curiously, they didn't have to go to that church, but they had to be able to point to it. Because there was a way in which we knew how we fit. What we knew back then is that if you were a Baptist and the world was good to you, you might eventually become a Methodist. And if you were a Methodist and you worked hard enough, you could become a Presbyterian. And if God was good and all went well, you could eventually become Episcopalian. See, you know this stuff. The Ford Motor Company had a basic automobile that they called the Ford, and then they had the Lincoln, which was their luxury. And when they looked at those, what they decided, it's in their history, that there were some people who wanted to have more than the people's car, which was the Ford, but they couldn't really, and they didn't want to, and it wouldn't be appropriate to buy the Lincoln. So what did they do? They made the Mercury, because everybody had a place to fit. I remember doing a consultation one time in a mill town. One mill kind of served the whole town. 2 United Methodist churches. One of the churches was for the owners and the managers of the mill, and the other was for the workers. Everybody knew. And if you were a worker in the mill and you got a promotion and you became a manager, what did you do? You changed churches. Joining, belonging, membership was an act of identity. It's how we participated. Belonging and possessions told you and others who you were. And so, if you will, for the most part, people just simply needed a church in order to be part of the community. Now, that doesn't mean that the church wasn't doing faithful ministry with those people. Don't hear that. But just hear that there was a time in which the culture pushed people toward us, and our primary responsibility was to receive them. We're now at a time, and we're going to go into this much deeper here today, friends. We're now at a time in which the United Methodist Church claims for itself that our mission is no longer to make members. We are now to make disciples. Have you heard that? I was not trained to make disciples, because disciples are changed people. Disciples are people who have been changed by their encounter with Christ. I was not trained to change people's lives. I was only trained to change their affiliation. I came to my ministry with a membership model in a culture in which people no longer join. So we do need to talk about what's happening in the current reality. this deeply changed mission field. And here, we're not going to talk about the church right away. And in fact, a lot of what is happening in the church is so deep below and beneath that it's hard for us to see it at times at the surface. But hear how deep some of the changes have been. In our lifetime, friends, space itself has been redefined from local to global. You all know this. We now live in a global economy. How many of you have a computer? How many of you have a computer that when you don't have a 15-year-old around to fix it, you have to call the hotline, the technical hotline? And when you do that, where is the person that you're talking to? In India. Absolutely. And space makes absolutely no difference in terms of the work that you have to do. Right now, if you make a reservation at a restaurant in Manhattan, when you call for your reservation, you may well be talking to someone in Ireland, but by the time you get to the restaurant, your table is waiting. Ours is a global world. One of the studies that I just keep coming back to time after time after time has to do with our Midwest, where there are two dominant industries. One is the automobile industry and the other is agriculture. Both of them have suffered deeply because of the global economy that has surrounded them. And one of the things that the research has pointed out is they struggle with coping with that global reality because they continue to think locally. In the Midwest, every state has state lines. Inside every state line, there are county lines. Inside the county lines, there are township lines and town lines and all these different areas that we have parsed out into local areas, all of which have their own municipalities. So at a time when the competition has gone up all across the world and the resources available have gone down, instead of getting together for a global conversation, what they do locally is that they compete with each other over diminished resources. Do you hear it? They go directly to the local conversation. And here we are in the United Methodist Church with conferences with lines, districts with lines, churches with lines, and congregations that still function in local space. How many of you have a church that when a committee or a governing board meets, they want to make sure everybody's in the room at the same time in order to have the conversation? And how many of you are in a church that when they get everybody in the room to have that conversation, they can have the conversation and make the decision, but if a couple of people are absent, they don't mind coming back next month to have the same conversation because we want to make sure that everybody, you hear what's happening? That's our old norms of local space living in a global world. If space has been redefined, time has been redefined. We have moved from a linear to an instant time. We've moved from a time in which you only did one thing at a time, and you were very careful how you moved ahead. You went from A to B to C to D. And now we're in a time in which we multitask, when time itself is instant, when things happen multiply. And yet, for the most part, our congregations still function in linear time. You've got a good idea? Take it to the committee so that they can talk about it. And then the committee can take it to the governing board so that they can talk about it. So that the committee can talk about how they might want to move ahead. And 4 months down the road, we are still in linear time. Have you seen it? Have you been there? Have you done it? Sure. We are holding close to that which we know. Along with that, part of this deeply changed mission field is we move from we to me. Our values themselves have been redefined. This is actually the biggest part of the picture and one that we're going to move on and talk about in a couple of different ways. But just look how deep these changes are. This is not the cosmetic stuff that has to do with consumerism that we're so often hearing about. These are the values that are so deep beneath us. Dan Yankovic, who was one of the primary researchers in cultural values, talks about the fact that they are often like tectonic plates, those large plates that our whole continents rest on. You all know what I'm talking about? We don't know what they're doing. We don't really pay attention to where our tectonic plates are. When's the last time you woke up in the morning and asked, I wonder how my plates are doing today? It just isn't part of what we think about. But when they shift, something happens at the surface, and we call it an earthquake, and we are very aware. We've been living through the earthquake unaware that it is the values beneath us that have been shifting that call us to a very different ministry. Part of this is the generational values that we're wrestling with. Every single generation sets its own values, and it sets its values as a corrector to the excess that they saw in the generation that went before them. You can see this in things such as child rearing practices. You have one generation that is very strict with all kinds of boundaries that they want their children to live with, only to be followed by the next generation that wants their children to have a tremendous amount of freedom, only to be followed by the next generation that wants boundaries and kind of rules again. Have you seen it in your families? Every generation sets its values as a corrector in the excess that they see in the generation that went before, which means that every single generation speaks badly of the one that went before and the one that comes after. And what that means in a vital congregation, which is a road we're not going to go down today, but what that means in a vital congregation is that if your congregation is vital, then in fact it is appropriately uncomfortable with itself because you have multiple generations of people who share the same faith but have contesting values. One of the things that is the enemy of the church right now is neatness, where we try to get everybody to agree with everybody and try to figure out who's right, instead of asking what's right. So we are in this time in which we have this great generational divide. One of the things that Robert Withnaw has pointed out is that every once in a while we don't go through these modest changes of correction of these values. We go through a time in which the values themselves become oppositional. They are 180 degrees in opposition to each other. And this is what we have been going through in our lifetime, friends. The way in which it's often talked about in the literature is the great difference between what is known as the GI generation, or I guess that's on this side for you, the GI generation and the consumer generation, in which their values are 100% opposite. The GI generation is a people who find their identification as a group, as opposed to the consumers who do that as an individual. The GI generation loves sameness. The consumers love difference. The GIs know deferred pleasure and stewardship. Consumers, instant gratification and generosity. They're all differences. But then what it comes down to is that they also practice different spirituality. The GIs practice a spirituality of place. The issue is that if you are of that generation with those values and you want an encounter with Christ, where would you expect to find it or to find it anchored except where the group goes? And so the church itself takes on a very sacred nature. The building takes on a very sacred nature. How many of you know people who change their language from the parking lot to the sanctuary? Even the volume of their language, because they have stepped into the place of the people where we encounter God. I did a consultation with an American Baptist church in Portland, Maine one time, and we were going through an awful lot of these kinds of things, and finally I had to say to one gentleman, what you're telling me is that when the acolyte goes up and lights the candles, that because you can see the sneakers under the gown, that the candles really aren't lit and you can't start worship. And he said, right, you got it. Because you see, in that generation, there's a sacredness of place. And secular shoes intrude, despite the fact that the sneakers cost 3 times his shoes. Well, the consumer generation doesn't practice a spirituality of place, they practice a spirituality of journey. If you are of this value system, where would you expect to encounter Christ? Where would you find an encounter with Christ except any place and every place that you are willing to go to seek? And so these are the folk who show up at your church because they love the worship, the music, and the preaching. But then they take their kids over to the Lutheran church because they have better youth trips. And they go to Wednesday morning Bible study with that Southern Baptist woman who knows more about the Bible than God. And then on Friday afternoon, they end up at yoga because it centers them. Do you hear what happened? They are, in fact, practicing a kind of discipleship that we have been asking for. But they have done it in a journey fashion all around. This is part of where we have to come to terms with who we are and what we do. There was a consultation with a United Methodist church, a fairly large United Methodist church. There were about 30 leaders in the room. And what they asked me to do was to come and work with them about a discrepancy, because they had already taken their measures. What they discovered was that their church was growing at 4% a year, good growth. But their community was growing at 7% a year. And so what they wanted to talk about was, why is our church not growing as fast as our community? And I always explained that, for a consultant, this is exactly the kind of conversation you want. Here's some folks that already did their homework. They already have an informed question. They already want to get to work. And so we get started, and within 20 minutes, I'm listening to them talk about how their church is not growing. It's not growing. So I stopped and I observed that we have gone through this change. And I said, we've already looked at the graph. We've already looked at your growth, but yet you're talking about not growing. And the chairperson said, well, yeah, Gil, yeah, you're right. We are growing. But they're not good members. Yeah. See, friends, what you need to know is if you say something like that to a consultant, the consultant has you right where he wants you. And so I said, great. What I want you to do is I want you to get in small groups, and I'd like you to describe a good member. And what did they describe? Themselves. If you want to be a good member, you have to come to worship regularly, you have to support the budget regularly, you have to serve on a committee, sing in the choir, and make potato salad. You've got to do the whole piece. Fair enough? And if you don't do that, you are known as what? A bad member. So what does that mean for a denomination and a mainline church that grew up and was trained in a membership model that now wants to talk to people who are actively in search of discipleship in their lives? Do you hear the level and the depth of the challenge that we're after? We're actually trying to work with people who live with different questions. That part of our church, which still operates out of the membership model, is asking the question, how will everybody fit into and support this group or support this community or support this church? And we do ask an awful lot of questions about what should we expect from people to support congregation. But in the discipleship model, that's not the question at all. The people who are actively in search of discipleship in their lives are more often asking, how will my engagement with Christ and with the church change my and change others' lives? Do you hear that they are absolutely different questions? And you and I are living in between them. We'll come back to that. So let's push ahead. If all of this cultural stuff has changed, if the generational values have changed, friends, our theology has been shifting as well. And here we're going to turn to the work of Harvey Cox. And Cox has said that if you take a look at the history of Christianity, we are in now the third of our theological stages. He talks about the age of faith, the age of belief, and the age of spirit. The age of faith was a time in which the people trusted in Jesus. Do you hear that? They trusted in the person of Jesus. This is really talking about the disciples, the one who knew Jesus. They had a relationship that they could trust. And then after the disciples, it was those who knew the disciples who knew Jesus, who trusted in Jesus. And then it was those who knew the people who knew the disciples who knew Jesus. And so Cox says for about 300 years, the theology of the church focused in on a trust in this person. It was a relational faith, a relationship with Jesus. But then starting with the great councils of the church, we began to pay attention to the age of belief. No longer a trust in a person, but now a belief in Jesus. Do you hear what happened? We moved from the relationship to the idea. And what became important here was whether or not people believed the right thing. The Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, all of the creeds of the church, all of the structured theologies of the church that helped us to get it right were terribly important up through that time. To the extent that believing the right things became the mark, the dominant mark of the Christian faith. My friend Diana Butler Bass, as an Episcopalian, was asked by her priest, Diana, would you like to teach the confirmation class? And she said, well, I don't know. Tell me something about it. And the priest said, it's 9 weeks long. In the first 4 weeks, we teach the history of Christianity and the history of the Episcopal Church. In the next 4 weeks, we teach the Nicene Creed. And on the 9th week, we give them a test. And if they pass, they're Christian. Do you hear what happened? Everything was focused in on the mind. That is not the question that our culture is asking us today. Cox says that we have moved on to the age of the Spirit. We are now at a point where people are asking about an experience of Jesus. There was a time, and how many of you remember the old adage that as the Sunday school goes, so goes the church? Anybody remember that? That was all about the fact that the dominant door that people would use to get into a local church was the Sunday school. That's where they found their community. That's where they would be with people. They may or may not go on to worship, but that's where they kind of ground themselves. During my adult life, the primary door that people came into the church was through the worship experience. As a matter of fact, for many of us, that was the only experience of the people in my generation of the church. They may or may not go to Sunday school. They may or may not go to any other kind of program, but they would go to worship. Today, what we're beginning to see is the dominant door for people to come into the church is neither the Sunday school nor worship, but it's through mission. People who want to put their hands to something so that it changes not only somebody else's life, but their life as well. It is now easier for young people in our culture to turn to a friend and not say, would you like to go to church with me? Because you see, that's inviting somebody to an explanation in many of our congregations. Often I'm with people who decry the state of preaching today, and one of the things that I feel very deeply is one of our dilemmas with preaching is that if you've been trained as I have, you are still trying to offer explanations for questions that people are not asking. Young people are not going to say to a friend, "Would you like to go hear a good explanation this morning?" They're going to say, "Would you like to help me make a difference?" So we're caught with where we are and where we're going. Let's keep going. Do you hear how deep this change is in the mission field? This is not easy stuff. The next new United Methodist program is not going to fix this. It's deeper than that. In North America, when I was growing up, there was only 3 choices you could make in terms of a faith identity: Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. Remember those days? Will Herberg was a sociologist who wrote the text called Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, and that was really kind of the statement of our cultural dominance at that time. That book was last reprinted in 1983, meaning as early as only 30 years ago, that was still a dominant idea. Today, when Mark Chavez, who's the primary researcher for the National Congregation Study, when he does his count, he doesn't look at 3 religious groups in North America, he looks at 13. The field has opened up. And look at what we have here. White Protestant and black Protestant, even they have different trajectories in our culture. And then you've got Catholic, Jew, Mormon, Eastern Orthodox, Muslim, Hindu. Look at that list, including agnostic and atheists, which are recognized as value systems in our culture today. And the one that grows the fastest is the nones, the people who are spiritual without being religious, the people who are still in search of meaning in their lives through an encounter with God, through an encounter with Christ, but would prefer not to do it in an organized institution. How are we doing? We okay? How many of you know that there is no established religion in the United States? Come on, friends, be honest. How many of you heard that before? There is no established church like there is in a number of the nations in Western Europe. How many of you know that as a United Methodist, as a member of part of the mainline Protestant tradition, you have from the very beginning been part of the established church in the United States, de facto? You are the established church. Well, you were. The whole landscape has changed. And the problem there for us is that once you have been established, you no longer ask questions about who you are and what you are to do. You don't ask questions of identity and purpose because they're a given. They must be a given. Everybody else is trying to look like you. And so when you're the established church, you don't ask about who you are and what God wants you to do. All you do is you keep doing what you've done, because other people are trying to be like that as well. Do you know, I actually did a consultation one time in a Hindu congregation, and in the Hindu congregation, there were committees. Friends, that would not happen any place except in North America. I am so serious about that. Because they knew right away that in order to live in this new land, they had to, in many ways, look like others. They even had a committee on evangelism. That's what they called it, the Committee on Evangelism. And the Committee on Evangelism was to check in with all the neighbors to make sure nobody was having any problems that could create a stir for them. But when you're the established religion, everybody's busy trying to look like you. We're now at a time when people are no longer worried about looking like us. How are we doing? We okay? All right, don't forget, nod your head. Because this is where we have to talk about how this new mission field ended up surrounding us and us being surprised. Did we not see this as it was happening? Let me point out two things. One is that we are known, we meaning North American congregations, are known as low-threshold organizations. It doesn't take much to get in, and it takes even less to get out. It's not like employment where you have to apply to be able to be received and come in and start work, and if you want to leave, there are steps and kind of processes you have to follow. Now, in the church, all you have to do is show up, and you're a part of it. In a lot of our smaller churches, all you have to do is show up 3 times, and you're on the board. Very low threshold, but an equally low threshold on the way out. All you have to do is stop attending. And if you do it well, they won't even recognize it. You hear it? Think about that, friends. If you are in an organization which has low thresholds and you're living in a culture that is pushing people towards you and you are a leader, what is your primary responsibility? Your primary responsibility is to receive people and then keep them happy. Because if they're not happy, where are they going to go? They're going to go out the back door. They're going to go right back over the threshold. And so for a lot of our clergy, for a lot of our congregations, for our governing boards, the dominant mode in which we did our work was around satisfaction. Are people happy here? How many of you have ever served on a staff parish relations committee, a pastor parish relations committee? My wife and I have agreed that whatever happens for the rest of our lives, we will never do that. And one of the reasons, friends, is because most of our staff parish relations committees do not know what the goals of ministry and mission are for the church. They don't know what the church is called to make different. And so what they do is they revert to values of satisfaction, and they measure the effectiveness of ministry by counting the number of complaints. Because we have for too long committed ourselves to happiness and satisfaction. Because, and don't miss this, because there was a time in which that was appropriate. There was a time in which that was appropriate. And so we haven't seen all these changes that have be coming around us. And the second part of this is why it's so hard, is that norms outlive people. Why has this mission field changed around us to our surprise? Because the norms that have been established in our congregation have far outlived the people who set them. Do you all know that in some of our congregations there are some pews that you can't sit in because they belong to somebody else? In my visits to so many congregations, I have discovered those pews by sitting in them. And one, I was informed that I was sitting in someone's pew, and so I apologized, and I said, "Is he here?" And they said, "Well, no, he's been dead for 4 years." The norms by which we live together have outlasted the people who have set them. Let's walk a little deeper here, because I did a consultation one time with a Presbyterian church. This was a terrible conflict, which is why I like to point out it was Presbyterian. And I got called 2 years after the new pastor had been called as the new pastor. He had replaced the founding pastor who had been there for 27 years and retired and stayed in the community. And he was told when he was called that part of the change that they had to work their way through was a change in worship, because their worship had stayed so steady over that 27 years that it was clear to the people that they had to make some adjustments. How are we doing? We okay so far? The bad news is that he believed them, and he began to make some changes. And so they had conflict, naturally, as you would expect, and so I was invited in, and I began to listen to people, tried to understand what the issues were, and I was taken back by this one young woman who was about 30 years old, who was just adamant about what had happened. She knew what the solution was here, and the solution was to take the new pastor out in the parking lot and run him over 2 or 3 times. She was angry, to the point that I invited her to the side so that I could help her talk a little bit. And what I discovered was that the real big issue was that the pastor wanted to hire some child care workers to take care of the children in the nursery so the mothers could go to worship, which obviously is a deep sin. Okay. Now, the issue here is a woman who would gladly pay someone for child care so that she could go and do things that were important to get done. Here is a woman who wouldn't mind taking her child to a group where someone was being paid for the whole group so that her child could have this experience with other children. And here was someone who would like to condemn her pastor for offering the same opportunity on Sunday morning. Why? When you listen to her, it was because when she was in the nursery, her mother cared for the children who were in the nursery. The family story is that when her mother was in the nursery, guess who cared for the children in the nursery? Her grandmother. This was a woman who had the same values as everybody else who was 30 years old with children and a hectic schedule, until she walked back into the congregation, which was still living by norms that had been set by people no longer there. How are we doing? We okay? Well, friends, this is where we really need to come to terms with when you're in this kind of a wilderness of deep change. One of the issues that we have to face into is that this mission field that we've been talking about has so deeply changed that we have lost our connection to it. And when any system loses its connection with its environment, it begins to die. So we are now faced with either deep change or slow death. That's why there's a conversation going on in the United Methodist Church. That's the real message of unsustainability. Now, friends, I've been going at it for a while here. Just turn to a neighbor for a couple of minutes, just a couple of minutes. Talk about your church. Talk about your experience. Do you see yourself in this description? Do you find yourself? What's it like for you? So if you would, just visit with a neighbor for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come right back. Come back. Come on home. All right, friends, come on home if you would, please. May I ask, how many of you were able to see yourselves and your church in this description that we've been working on? This is us. And this is why the conversation is needed. The question is whether or not you would be willing to consider that our current crisis is a gift from God. We are in the wilderness. And the people of God have always been reformed and renewed in the wilderness, because that's where we're changed. If the Israelites had left Egypt and taken a bus using the turnpike, they could have gotten to the promised land a lot quicker. But they would have arrived unchanged. They still would have been a slave people. It takes the wilderness to renew us, to reform us, to reframe us, and to make us God's people again. Walter Brueggemann, who is in fact the biblical theologian who probably is one of my deepest spiritual anchors and refreshes my soul, continues to say that the Israelites, whenever they went into the wilderness, had to answer two questions. How will we now be with God? And how will we now be with one another? Those are our questions in this wilderness. And what Brueggemann points out is that when the Israelites left Egypt and went out into the wilderness, their answer at that time was the Ten Commandments. This is now how we will be with one another and with God. When they were in the exile, they had the Levitical Code. What, 600 and how many different rules? That's how they would now be with one another. Brueggemann points out we hate the Levitical Code. And then he points out that that's okay. It wasn't meant for us. It was the other time in the wilderness, not this time. How will we now be with God, and how will we now be with one another? And for this next part, we're going to take a little bit of a side trip here to try to get at this. Let's go through a simple systems model very, very quickly. This is the model that we use in Texas Methodist Foundation for an awful lot of the work we do here. It comes from Edwards Deming. Deming was the guy who was credited with turning Japanese manufacturing around after the Second World War. That manufacturing industry was destroyed by the war, and when the war was over, it had to be rebuilt. And with Deming's help, not by Deming alone, but with Deming's help, they rebuilt an industry not in the way that it once was, but in a totally different way. Prior to the Second World War, Japanese manufacturing had a reputation of making some of the world's best junk. And then after their wilderness, they became a center of high technology and have remained since. So we're not just talking about rebuilding something, we're talking about transforming something. And the model that he used is very simple. You can take a look at any system and think about it in terms of what goes in, what you do with it, and what comes out. The input, the throughput, and the output. The input are the resources that go into the system. Those are our nouns. The throughput are our activities. That's what we do with those things, and that's our verbs. And the output, or the outcome, is the difference we're trying to measure. How are we doing? We okay so far? A fairly simple system. Don't forget, nod your head. It encourages the speaker. But then if you go into this, what you discover is that this is particularly problematic for nonprofit organizations. For-profit organizations are pretty clear about this. What goes into the system is money, You do things with it. What comes out of the system is more money, and if you did your work well, what comes out is more than what went in. And they are all measurable quantifiables. Nonprofits don't have it so easy. One of the things that Peter Drucker has pointed out is that nonprofits routinely do not know what we're trying to produce. How many of you can say that very, very clearly all of the leaders in your congregation are aware and in agreement of the difference that you are trying to make in this next year? We got one hand so far. That's not the typical conversation for any nonprofit. Drucker went on to say that the outcome of any nonprofit is an improved human being. It's a good answer. It's the right answer. It tells you absolutely nothing about what you should be working on tomorrow. We want to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Great. What's the change you have to work on to make a disciple? That's a difficult conversation for us. We don't know what we're trying to produce. And systems that can't measure their outcomes commonly measure their inputs. They actually measure their inputs and their throughputs, their nouns and their verbs. How many of you have had that conversation with your governing board about, do we have enough money in our budget this month? Have you had that conversation? How many of you have had that conversation about how can we get more members in our church in order to support what we're trying to do here? How many of you have that conversation about how many young people are in our youth group now? All of those conversations that we have, friends, are conversations about our inputs and our throughputs, about our nouns and our verbs, our resources and our activities. Because when we don't know what we're trying to produce, there's very little else for us to talk about. This is why it's tough right now, because we are in the middle of a paradigm shift. A paradigm is just that set of assumptions that we all hold in terms of how the world works. And our United Methodist Church, along with other mainline denominations, is going through this huge shift because of these cultural descriptors that we just talked about. And the old paradigm was that the outcome of our United Methodist system was that we were to have more members, we were to have satisfied clergy and satisfied congregations. I do an awful lot of work with district superintendents, and one told me about a former district superintendent who used to say regularly, if at the end of the appointment season all of my clergy are happy and all of my congregations are happy, then all my work is done. That is a system built on producing satisfaction. But that's not who we say we are anymore. Now we are a people who are to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the faith. Our output is to be changed people. Now, this is not a shift in language, friends. This is a total reorientation. Don't forget what we just described about low-threshold organizations and a culture that pushes people to you. What you do is you keep them as happy as you can for as long as you can so they don't go away, and it's all about satisfaction. Can we satisfy the preferences of the people who are already here? Discipleship is not about satisfying people, it's about dissatisfying people. The early church fathers used to talk about it in terms of the cure of souls. In the cure of the souls, if you meet someone who needs support, you support them. If you meet someone who needs encouragement, you encourage them. If you meet someone who needs to be challenged, you challenge them. If you meet someone whose behavior needs to be corrected, guess what you do? You correct it and you give them a better question to ask in their lives. That was the story of Jesus and all of the New Testament stories. He always left people with a better question than they had, for which very few of them ever said thank you. What does it mean for a church that tries to shift from satisfying everybody's preferences to challenging everybody's satisfaction? This is very different work. How are we doing? Does this make sense? Just nod yes. Come on. Yeah, this is where we are. This is who we are. This is part of why it's so hard. One of the things that pushes us to do is ask ourselves, who is our client? And, I'm only using that language in terms of who is it that we are now in our corner of God's kingdom? Who is it that we're supposed to be paying attention to? It's not the people who are already in our churches. It's not our clergy. It's not our congregations. It's the mission field. Whether the mission field is in the hearts of the people who are there, who need discipleship. Do you know right now we're at a point where the United Methodist Church is asking congregations to make disciples, and we're doing that with congregations that do not practice discipleship. Part of the mission field is us and the changed spirit that needs to go with us, but the rest of it is being able to look out there and to see what else we're going. Therefore, that is a telephone pole. That has more wires than it needs. Did you notice? That is a telephone pole in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, post-war. What happened after the war is that as they began to rebuild the electrical system, they couldn't figure out which lines worked and which didn't. So they just kept stringing new ones. So what you have there is the pre-war electrical system and the post-war electrical system. And I got to tell you, it's hard to work with. We okay so far? What does it mean to be United Methodist in which we are living with the old paradigm and the new paradigm at the same time? You see, when the paradigm shifts, one doesn't go away. You still have membership expectations back in your local church. You still have people who are wondering when you come back from your annual conference what you can now do to make them more satisfied. But you're invited into the conversation so that you have a different conversation to go home with, one that's more connected to the new mission. But don't think that you will work on the new mission without the old mission being in the same room with you all the time. How are we doing? Anybody starting to guess this is hard work? Okay. So we've been working at it. We have a call to action. Now, don't miss the fact that, a man of my age has a PowerPoint in which something's actually moving. I want credit where credit is due, is what this is all about. We have been busy. And among other things, we've been busy making ourselves uncomfortable. And so we've been focusing in on vital congregations, and this is absolutely necessary, but it is also very uncomfortable, because if the only thing we pay attention to is how many vital congregations we have, that is known as a new form of institutionalism, unless we understand that vital congregations are the places that disciples are made. And that the only reason we really need vital congregations is because we are a people who make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And we are paying attention to measures and metrics. Again, a very uncomfortable conversation for us. What does it mean to be able to be in a situation where you've got to count numbers about things over which you don't have control? And what does it mean to count only those things that you know how to count when most of the most important stuff is beyond that? There's a whole lot that we have to still work with, learn about, and continue to work with here. In my work, one of the things we're doing is paying an awful lot of attention to the Episcopal role and the district superintendent roles, to the structure of conferences. The annual conference, even though it is the local church, which is the place where the mission of the church will be accomplished. It's the local church that makes disciples. Still, much of the transformation of our denomination is going to happen at the annual conference level, because this is where you direct resources. This is where you have to come to terms with what's most important, so you can put your resources to what's most important in a time when we don't have enough resources to put them every place, which is the way it used to be. And friends, we are in the midst of a herd of experiments. You are being invited into the Nashville area conversation. Yours is not the only conversation going on. There are multiple experiments all over the connection. We can point to an awful lot of places, such as Arkansas, which has greatly reduced its structure, its staff, the way that they use presiding elders, the way that they're now using technology instead of committees. We can point to the Carolinas. Both of the Carolinas went from 15 and 14 districts down to 8 districts. And in North Carolina, there are no district offices. They now use virtual offices while the district superintendent continues to work with people. You can go to Louisiana, where they have 4 different standards of congregations that they're inviting everybody to get into the conversation, to self-identify what kind of a congregation you are, so that we can talk about what your goals are for the next year or 2 years. You can go to the Susquehanna Conference. Do you all know about the Susquehanna Conference? That's our newest conference. One of our newest conferences. It is now a merger of 2 of the old Pennsylvania conferences, the Wyoming Conference and Central Pennsylvania. It is now called the Susquehanna Conference. It is the only conference that no one in our connection will ever learn how to spell. It has moved from well over 40 committees, each of which was peopled by 10 or 12 persons to do that work. They are now down to 5 teams. Each of those teams for the work in the ministry of that conference has about 10 people on it. We now have 50 people that are replacing several hundred. How great is that? Because the dominant message there is, you can't do what everybody used to do, so stop trying. Let's learn something new. All of these experiments are going on. We are, friends, not following a map in the wilderness. This is one of the things that I try to point out as often as I can. We are not following a map in the wilderness. The Israelites, look at the map in the back of the Bible. The Israelites were not following a map, they were making a map. And so I turn to one of the real roots of my life, Bilbo Baggins. All who wander are not lost. But perhaps more to the point, Joshua. After the Israelites crossed the Jordan River and were to set off, what Joshua said to the people, you will know the way you should go, even though you've never traveled this way before. Friends, what we're after here is an act of confidence, which is why you're being invited into a conversation. This is a conversation because the day of the expert is over. No one can come and stand up here and tell you the answer. If we have been going through denominational decline for well over 50 years, if someone had figured it out, don't you think they would have mentioned it by now? The day of the expert is over. Conversation is how we will now learn what nobody else can teach us, which is why you're invited into a conversation. It matters what we talk about, because what we talk about changes us. David Bohm, a Nobel Prize winner, talks about dialogue. He's the fellow who helped us understand dialogue more than anything else. In dialogue, one of the things he points out is that when I say something, you respond. And with your response, I now know that you didn't understand what I was trying to say. And so what I do is I clarify. And in my clarifying, you now understand that I didn't know what you were saying. And then he points out, if we stay in that conversation long enough, we will teach each other what neither of us knew. Why is your strategic mapping team inviting you into a conversation? It's not just a conversation with you, but it's a conversation between you and God about what is God calling your annual conference to do with the corner of God's kingdom that you've been given now. So it's a conversation among you, it's a conversation with God, but it's also a conversation with the mission field. You realize so far the only one that we haven't talked to is the mission field where we're living? So the issue here, friends, is what is the conversation that you want to take home with you to get started in the wilderness with your leaders? Your strategic mapping team will have more for you to work on. It will have a time over this coming year for you to participate, for you to listen, to learn, to teach. But where's the conversation that you want to get started when you go home from annual conference this year? One of the primary definitions of leadership is to always give the people a better conversation to have. So what is yours for your starting point? Friends, thank you for your time, for your attention. Bishop McAlilly, may I invite you to come in and close us here.
Well, the pot should be sufficiently stirred by now. So where do we go from here? And where will we and what kind of conversations will we engage? Where will we engage one another? One of the things that we will very quickly begin to do is we will take our mapping team and our steering committee for the Memphis Conference before the month is over, and we will determine where and when we will begin having those conversations. Our idea is to push this out to the grassroots of the church. Sue Engle gave me a good image a while back from Bill Hybels, and Bill Hybels calls it 1,000 cups of coffee. And I don't think it's possible for me to have 1,000 cups of coffee, but I do think it's possible for us to have 1,000 cups of coffee in conversation with where God is leading us across the Memphis Annual Conference, across the Tennessee Conference, across the Nashville area. We have gotten clarity about two things. I might refer to them as core values. One is this: offering Christ to a hurting world. If we can agree that our call as we seek to make disciples for the transformation of the world is to offer Christ to a hurting world, if we can agree to that as a starting point, what does that begin to look like in your community, in your neighborhood, as we spoke last night? You now know, after having heard Gil, where most of my insight and input has been coming from over the last 10 or 11 months. You might have noticed last night in my sermon some themes that Gil has been weaving across our area. The second core value, if you will, is discipleship as a lifestyle, not a program. Offering Christ to a hurting world, discipleship as a lifestyle, not a program. What does that begin to look like in your community of faith as you seek to engage the mission field in your community? It does mean that we have to do some things differently. In some places, the mission field may be taking your church bus that no longer is run anymore and going to another community and picking up children from another community and bringing them back to your church so you can have Vacation Bible School. Imagine that. In some places, it may mean that you begin to engage in jail ministry, prison ministry in your community, that there are people who are incarcerated who are in need of the gospel of Jesus Christ. One of the things that Lynn and I have conversation around our table about regularly, since Lynn is a former educator, a second grade school teacher, is what would it look like in every community if every local congregation partnered with the local school in that community? How might we begin to change the lives of children and youth and their parents because we, in fact, engage that mission field? I don't know what it's going to look like. And I want you to know right up front as we begin this life together, I don't have the answers. If you're saying, are you the one or shall we look for another? You may want to start looking for another. But what I do believe this at the very core of my being, that the answers that we need in the Memphis Conference are within the people called Methodists within the bounds of the Memphis Conference. I believe we already have all we need to do what God is calling us to do right now in this place and this time. And I also believe that time is running out. And so in every way I know how, I want you to get me saying that, friends, it's urgent. I don't want you to think that we can outlive this bishop, and if we'll just bear with it long enough, he'll be gone, and there'll be another one to come along, and they'll have another idea. Okay? Because, friends, in 8 years, we're not going to have any more time. And so I cannot impress upon you how urgent this is to us. We are not sustainable. And if we think we are, we're kidding ourselves. If you notice the number of people retiring versus the number of people we're ordaining tonight, we do not have a culture of call to ministry in this annual conference. We are not raising up a new generation of leaders in this annual conference. How are we going to do that? We've got to create a culture of leadership, lay and clergy, because what we know is what we have been learning is not enough to do what God is calling us to do now. I'm not equipped, Gil's not equipped, you're not equipped to do the work that God needs us to do right now. We don't know enough, and so we have to continuously be engaging in ways to deepen our knowledge of theology and practice and faithfulness, how to engage the culture. We have to continue to push toward alignment across the annual conferences. Boards of ministry are practicing that for us already. And we have to deepen our life in prayer. And we have to marry evangelism and mission as one and the same, not two different things. John Wesley's theology was rooted in Luke 10:27. You shall love the Lord your God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's mission and evangelism. That's our task. Matthew 25 and Matthew 28. When did we see you hungry, and go ye therefore into all the world? So I'm asking for your help. I'm asking for you to ask your congregation to roll up your sleeves and help us figure this out. And when the conversation comes to your neighborhood, I invite you to be a part of it. Throwing stones at the conversation is not going to help us along the way. Not. When I was a new church pastor, I learned to count the yes votes, not the no votes. If I had just counted the no votes, I would have not gotten out of bed in the mornings. And so I'm looking for a few disciples who are willing to join me in the conversation to engage the mission field in the Memphis Annual Conference. I hope you are willing to do that. But more than that, I pray that you are, for the sake of Jesus Christ and the transformation of the world. Thank you.